Hey, hi everybody. Good morning. I think maybe we'll get started. So thanks so much for being here and for having me. Yeah, do you think I should unmask Seth? Okay. I was going to try to do as much of this as I could with the mask, but my glasses will probably fog up anyway, as they tend to do. Welcome to a session called Platform Governance. That's the short title of the talk. The longer, much more unwieldy title of the talk is Fact and Justice Implications for Automated Governance Systems Deployed by User-Generated Content Platforms. I'm Rob Gorwa. I'm a postdoc at the BITZB Berlin Social Science Center, which is a publicly funded research institute based in, you guessed it, Berlin. And I'm a policy / kind of political science regulation scholar. And I've been invited here by Seth to give a talk on some of the work that me and some folks in the kind of interdisciplinary platform governance community that is starting up have been doing in the broad space of rulemaking and governance in the digital ecosystem. So most of my work focuses on user-generated content platforms, so social networks, YouTubes, Twitters, TikToks, etc. But hopefully I'll be able to kind of bring in a wider range of other types of platform services that many of you might be working with as well. And I have a short outline here. So I'm going to talk a little bit at first just about some of the kind of key ways that I've been approaching this field, a few kind of core concepts, the way that we're thinking about platform governance, at least in my work. And I'm then going to dive in a little bit more specifically into something which I think will be more relevant for all of you, especially those of you that are working more with algorithmic systems, with systems that employ automated decision-making. So I'm going to talk about some of the work I've been doing with some colleagues on automated content moderation systems that are being deployed by different platforms in different contexts. And we're going to dive into two kind of case studies, which I think are particularly interesting. So YouTube's Content ID and other similar copyright analysis and enforcement systems, and an interesting thing called the Global Internet Forum to Counter Terrorism's Shared Industry Hash Database, which is a pretty fascinating kind of example of a co-regulatory, quasi-multi-stakeholder institutional arrangement that has propped up in the last few years, where multiple industry actors are now kind of banding together under pressure from governments to try to more effectively, I guess, fight online terrorism and extremism. So I'll end with some lessons learned. I think, there'll be, I hope, some clear takeaways in terms of the ways that there are fact implications for a lot of these systems. I'm also going to try to foreground a few kind of broader issues of political economy and the kind of policy context in which these systems are developed. So let's get rolling. So very quickly, I just wanted to start with a definition of content moderation, because that's a major focus of a lot of this work. So there's a paper that I especially like by legal scholar James Grimmelman. This paper is from 2015, but I think it was drafted or initially presented probably a decade earlier. So it's kind of an OG internet law paper. And when he was writing about a lot of the kind of almost Web 1.0 community platforms, he was thinking quite broadly about the broad realm of moderation systems and tools that platforms are implementing. So his definition isn't just about, okay, how do we flag a content or a piece of content, but it's more broadly about the kind of governance mechanisms that online communities are deploying and implementing, and the way that those governance mechanisms structure participation in the community, facilitate cooperation, and prevent abuse. And in practice, since then, there's been a growing number of especially media researchers, communications researchers, some legal scholars who have been kind of interested in the way that this, in the commercial rather than the community context, which Grimmelman was more writing about. So not just, bulletin boards and Usenets, but actually major, massive internet conglomerates, basically, that are really working at a completely different level of scale. Something that Sarah Roberts, an internet historian and kind of information scholar, has called commercial content moderation. So this done by scale. This has become an ecosystem that more and more people are kind of interested in investigating. And this is just a stylized glance at this, but there's a lot of different actors within a lot of companies, especially the major companies, that are making moderation decisions in a way. And this happens we could maybe think about this in the terms of a stack, where at the top you have, folks who are kind of overseeing decisions, whether they be executives in a company, whether they be the legal teams that are worrying about liability, whether it's the policy sides of a firm, to the folks slightly below them who are kind of involved in the actual nitty-gritty rule shaping. So the policy teams, some firms call this trust and safety. Others might call it online community management or integrity. And then so basically, I guess it's become a kind of subject of interest for a lot of legal scholars, a lot of media scholars, to think about the way that these are kind of creating complex bureaucracies that are involved in online governance in various ways. And these folks might create rules, but often in practice, the way that they're actually implemented and enforced is through a global network of often contracted labor. So most of us have probably seen news stories and other things about content moderators in various places. Increasingly, this is also being done, at least to a certain extent, in-house. We can talk about some of the regulatory efforts which are pushing companies to kind of reshore a lot of their moderation staff, or bring them kind of under their own umbrella. This is happening in places like Austin and Dublin, where major platforms have big offices. So those are kind of the broad range of actors that are involved in this. And a big one, which is, I guess, missing here, is the automated systems, which are increasingly also being tasked with enforcement. So anyway, just quick background here. And there's been a shift, I guess, in this work, I think, in the last few years, which has been going from looking at maybe more, I guess, esoteric or maybe more apolitical forms of moderation, to explicitly framing this as a governance problem. And I think this makes sense if we think about the way that media and comm scholars and other folks have basically been writing about how everything on a platform is architected. Everything from the way you interact with interfaces, the design choices that companies have made in those interfaces, the recommenders that you're interacting with, as well as the specific forms of content. Those design decisions, those implementation decisions can maybe be understood as a form of governance, in the sense of something that has an impact on other people, on their lives, on the way that they interact with the platform in the world. So if we kind of break this down at a more granular level, I think there's a few strands in the work that are emerging on this. And there's much more than this, but just to maybe give a high style overview. So one way in which platforms are governing is by creating rules. And this is something that I've been particularly interested in, but they've been developing, in many cases, very detailed community standards, which we, thanks to the work of many researchers and journalists, are kind of understanding more and more how they're developed and how complex they are. So this might be rules shaping, the policies around something like nudity or violent content. It takes companies into interesting directions, like having to define what art is, because maybe they might have exemptions, for artistic or journalistic or public interest content that depicts, for example, violence or depicts nudity. You've also got kind of broader normative structures, kind of like what Grimmelman was talking about. So this has been especially a focus of HCI folks who are looking at communities, maybe like Reddit or smaller ones, which are looking at the way that community moderators and other kind of actors in this ecosystem are engaging in the governance of a community or site. They're also kind of creating infrastructures, right? So the different interfaces that we interact with And again, what's interesting here is that a growing number of work has cataloged the kind of different actors in this ecosystem, with platforms often being kind of multi-sider markets that have complementers. So it's not just about governing their users, us, it's also about governing all the developers, all the advertisers, all the third parties that might be interacting on a marketplace or a social network, et cetera, et cetera. So this is the way, I guess, I have been thinking about this in a nutshell, which is to foreground this space as a site of political contestation. So a definition that I've used in some of my work most recently is thinking of this idea of platform governance as the question of how platform companies are setting and enforcing standards around their platform's use, and then the way that other actors or others seek to influence or control that process. So this kind of encompasses two sides of the equation, I think, which are emerging in a lot of the work that's happening here. So there's a longer tradition of work which is looking at the governance by platforms. So all these things we've talked about, choice architectures, terms of service, community guidelines and rules, and also the way that increasingly there's, as we heard Frederick talk about in the previous panel, through data protection frameworks, through competition policy, through content regulation, policymakers in different jurisdictions are increasingly interested in also specifically influencing how different types of online platforms can govern their users, how they can moderate content, and do other things. And there's different levels at which this is happening. So you have kind of baseline, intermediary liability, or other kind of institutional frameworks that might kind of set the playing field for technology companies to function as political actors in a specific context. We're also seeing more and more self-regulatory efforts by companies, either at the individual level or at the kind of industry-wide level, creating oversight boards, creating councils, creating all sorts of advisory regimes through which they kind of seek to increase the transparency and accountability of these decision-making procedures, at least ostensibly. And importantly, we're also seeing a lot of national level government intervention. So these are, we'll talk about them, but these are specific government-led regulatory regimes. They might be co-regulatory, they might be what the Germans call regulated self-regulation. So some form of nationally encoded or binding self-regulation, or just kind of more classic binding law. And also, slowly but steadily, we're also seeing some supranational action. So we're seeing things like trade agreements, which actually might enshrine provisions as to how different governments can regulate content moderation, platform governance in their jurisdictions. And the cute little arrows in the middle are to kind of illustrate that I think an important part of this dimension, and maybe the reason why I think this concept is more helpful than just a narrow content moderation lens, is the idea that these things are kind of mutually constitutive. They're mutually shaping each other. So importantly, what companies are doing in terms of designing their terms of service or community guidelines are in often ways a direct response to national regulation. And vice versa, interestingly, what platforms are doing, and as we'll see here, what they're doing, especially when those things are very technical and are almost at the infrastructural level, those are creating kind of important lock-in effects for future policy down the road. So just a quick slide to talk a little bit, at least in the content space, provide a quick few examples about the types of policy intervention that we're increasingly seeing. And this is more focused on user-generated content, content regulation, but I think we can make an argument that we're seeing this in different domains too, in ways that implicate all sorts of different, okay, thanks. Sorry, I'm like just seeing the chat now. Is this better? Yeah, okay, sorry. I hate talking to microphones, but so basically to just continue here, I wanted to mention how I think it's potentially helpful to wrap these two different domains of government intervention that we're seeing into a kind of formal bucket and an informal bucket. And this is just to say that we're seeing all sorts of national, state level kind of initiatives that are being led by specific governments in different contexts, especially in industrialized democratic contexts in the global north, but not exclusively. And big examples of this might be like the NetsDG, the DSA in the EU. These are really interesting to me because these aren't just about broad internet policy issues, but they're very specifically setting standards as to, they're trying to shape what companies are doing in the space of platform governance, of content moderation. They're laying down transparency rules saying, okay, you need to tell us about how you're making these decisions, who is making these decisions, how many moderators do you have, under what conditions, where are they based, and maybe we want to actually layer some type of government rule on top of what you're doing. So we want to say, hey, we want you to create a parallel flagging process, for example, in the NetsDG case, which will allow German citizens to report content not under your community guidelines, but under German law, as illegal under German law. So this is a kind of growing trend, which we're seeing. And we're also seeing a ton of informal work, which isn't codified in law. And critics of this in civil society especially might call this shadow regulation. This is a really interesting and kind of important area where basically powerful stakeholders, it's usually governments, but occasionally also civil society groups or specific kind of transnational activist or advocacy networks, band together and get companies on board to make some kind of code of conduct or other types of declaratory standard. And we have some examples of this too. If anyone has questions about any of these, maybe we'll tackle them after, but it's all just to say that we're seeing more and more government interest in this space. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about how this looks in the context of automated content moderation in the user-generated content and beyond context. So I'm going to talk a little bit about a paper that I did with a colleague who's a computer scientist, Ruben Binz at Oxford, and Christian Katzenbach, who's a COM scholar, SDS scholar at Bremen. And I put the paper, I think, in the chat here. But basically, one of the things we tried to do was understand the landscape of automated governance systems that are being deployed by major platforms in the content context. And maybe just as a word of context here, this is an important trend, I think, that has been developing. Some of you may have seen news articles that following the initial lockdowns due to COVID-19, companies were allegedly massively ramping up the amount of automated moderation that they were using because their moderators were unable to work or they were being sent home. But this is a trend that kind of predates that, as we'll see. So one of the things we wanted to do was to show that basically every major platform uses some form of automated moderation in some sense. And this is even encrypted platforms like WhatsApp. We'll talk about maybe the way that they use hash matching databases to look at things that aren't encrypted, for example, so profile photos. But basically across kind of a broad range of undesirable content areas, we see companies deploying all sorts of different things. So whether it's classifiers to detect violence or toxic speech, hash matching systems to detect and enforce against copyright violations or alleged copyright violations, do all sorts of forms for policing sexual content. And there's a long line of work on like why this is happening, especially from trying to pacify advertisers and other key stakeholders kind of point of view. But this is just a kind of high level overview. Yeah.
The screen's not sharing for the online audience.
Okay.
If you keep talking, I'll just fix it while I'm.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, it might be because I'm not sharing it through Hopin. I'm sharing it in another tab.
Yeah, no, that is the problem.
Okay.
Keep going.
Okay. So the main, I guess, point that we're making in this paper, which was to provide a bit of like an accessible primer on how these different technologies are working. Ooh, okay. I'll get there, but I just wanted to, I couldn't resist but share the slide just to say that this isn't just happening in the kind of social media context, but this is happening on a wide range of platforms. So there are all sorts of third-party services that are offering APIs and other tools that are doing these kinds of things on platforms like OnlyFans, Reddit, Yik Yak. I like this slide because they're saying, hey, They thought we couldn't solve automated content moderation or hate speech detection, but we did it. Yeah. Okay.
Okay, can we get this one to go full screen again?
Yeah, I can really see that.
Yep. How do you make full screen here? This one?
No, not that one. What the? Ah, I see. It's PDF file.
How did you get it full screen before, Rob?
Yeah.
Just clicked.
Or you can.
Yeah, I think it's this one.
Yeah.
Nice.
Yeah.
That works.
Okay.
Okay, we're back. Thanks, Seth. So another important use case of this is in the app context. So app stores, app marketplaces are also using all sorts of forms of automated detection to analyze apps at scale. This is basically something that every kind of major platform now needs to do. And, you know, it's not just app stores, it's not just user-generated content platforms, but it's also things like marketplaces. So this is another tool that I found this morning, which I thought was kind of interesting, because they're specifically talking about the way that this can be used to fulfill an economic logic on marketplaces. So for example, moderate user content on your marketplace in a way that would be impossible without an automated system. Make sure that they complete their purchases on your platform and detect attempts to share contact information or other online. So basically, if users on the marketplace are trying to go off the marketplace, the system will block them. So I just wanted to say this is a thing that exists in multiple contexts. So in this paper I was talking about with Ruben Binz and Christian, we kind of took a broad strokes approach into dividing these systems technically in terms of their affordances and their underlying functions into two broad camps, matching and prediction. And we'll talk about both these in turn. So matching systems basically use hash matching, some kind of cryptographic or statistical method for taking fingerprints of content. So the way that these systems work is that someone uploads a piece of content. It might be the user, it might be a third party like a copyright holder. And this image or video or piece of text or audio has a hash made of it. And then the system basically matches that against a list of known hashes. So what this allows platforms to do is to basically, in a computationally less expensive way, scale up content detection on things that are already known. So what's pretty remarkable now is that, for example, anytime you upload anything to Facebook or Instagram now, whether it be audio, whether it be text, whether it be a video, that is getting basically at the point of upload in the second before it goes online. They're taking a hash of that in the cloud, and then they're matching it to a massive series of databases to detect that it's not copyrighted or that it's not what they think might be terrorist imagery, for example. And based off of that potential match, there can be kind of different governance outcomes. So again, this is a spectrum, but this could be as soft as, okay, there's a potential match, so we're gonna flag it, or we might downrank it, or we might remove it. So that's more of a hard outcome. Or kind of in the highest stakes situation, we might not just flag and remove this, but there might be some kind of other knock-on effect. So for example, in the case of child abuse imagery, this is something that is widely used. You might have a strike levied against your account. You might actually be reported to the authorities in some way, right? So these are potentially relatively high stakes systems. The other broad bucket, and again, this is a bit of a stylization because there are systems that blur the lines between these two categories, are predictive systems. So again, nothing new, I think, to the folks in this room, but these are systems that are taking content that we don't know yet. So we're not matching and trying to find things that we are already, have already confirmed are, for example, child abuse imagery. We're trying to predict new instances of potential child abuse imagery by training data sets, training classifiers on data sets in the kind of usual way. And again, there can be different consequences of this. So again, this is another table from our paper, and all we wanted to kind of illustrate here was the way that there's different, I guess, political economic things going on and different roles of different actors in the system, including the humans. So as far as I know, when we wrote this paper in 2022, that's now 2020, there was really only one case that we could find by looking through the publicly available reporting that platforms had released themselves on cases where a predictive score was leading to a hard removal. So this is to say that it wasn't just flagging content, but it was actually removing content and potentially removing accounts without a human in the loop. And that was the context of a specific subset, they were saying, of Islamic, quote unquote, jihadist extremist content linked to groups like Al-Qaeda. So they were saying that they had predictive classifiers which were trained on corpus of these types of data. And when the confidence interval was at a certain point, they were just going and just making outright removals. But for the most part, it seems like the companies are aware that there can be false positives and false negatives in these classification decisions. So it usually goes to a human moderator after. There's still a lot we can say about that and the kind of affordances of these systems and the way that even flagging this type of content creates all sorts of potential unforeseen circumstances, but maybe let's save that for later for the Q&A. So I want to talk here maybe for 10-15 more minutes, and then I hope we can just have a discussion about some of this, about two systems quickly and how they were developed to illustrate, I guess, some of the broader kind of policy implications of this and how they were created. Getting another public safety alert. I thought I turned them off. So Content ID is a really interesting case in that it was maybe the kind of granddaddy of these automated hashing systems that are now widely used in different contexts. And it was created in an environment where, I believe YouTube had just been acquired by Google. Big Napster kind of outcry and case had happened. And there was a lot of pressure from copyright stakeholders to basically make sure that platforms like YouTube weren't just massive domains for copyright infringement. And under legal pressure, including a lawsuit from Viacom and some other major actors, YouTube started developing the system called Content ID, or a system that eventually morphed into Content ID. So this is, as far as we know, doing a thing called a perceptual hash. And what it's doing is it's allowing copyright stakeholders, so companies, for example, it could be let's say a record studio or a record label or a movie studio or some other actor. So copyright rights holders get a portal through which they can upload basically content. So they can upload songs, they can upload videos, and then these basically get stored and matched against existing and future content. So anytime anyone else makes an upload, the system is trying to they use these hashes to see whether or not something might be something that has already been uploaded. There are some funny stories about, for example, stakeholders accidentally getting a little bit too excited with the stuff that they upload and that leading to widespread removals, but that's another conversation. But what's interesting here is that there's different things that then the stakeholders can choose to do in the case of a potential match. And interestingly, we see from the empirical work on this topic, it's not actually usually to remove content. The most popular option is to demonetize, or we might say remonetize content. So this system basically lets copyrights holders say, okay, in the case of a match, or because it's doing a p-hash, so it's kind of like a fuzzy matching, so it might not be an exact match because the video might be modified, or it might even be using the song in the video. We will allow you to basically take their advertising revenue. And What's been interesting here is that I guess the context in which this was created has led the political economy of it to be really tilted towards the rights holders over users and creators. So arguably, and this is something that has really come out in a lot of the empirical legal work on this topic, it's very difficult for users to appeal these decisions, right? So if you make a video and it gets caught up in the system and your content gets demonetized, you're kind of hooked. So there aren't really any clear access points to observe or contest the system. This leads to folk theories. So creators are kind of trying to like reverse engineer content ID and figure out what kind of things are, making it more likely for them to get flagged by this. And again, while appeals technically exist, I think in practice they're quite onerous, and it's difficult to get a reversal. So users have all sorts of different strategies to kind of game with this. But the thing I just wanted to enforce here is that, the context in this case, and even though this is a voluntary system that companies are implementing, the way that has been implemented is really tilted arguably towards one set of interests over another. So the second system I wanted to talk about is something called the Global Internet Forum to Counter Terrorism. And this is really interesting because it's something that created, was the output of almost like bilateral negotiations between companies and European security actors through this thing called the Internet Forum, the EU Internet Forum, which started in 2015. And as a part of this process, as well as some kind of outcomes of this process, there was a code of conduct that was signed in the EU between major companies and the European Commission. Companies basically said that they would improve their industry collaboration around violent extremist and terrorist content, and that they would take a more active role in trying to develop and share technical solutions to try to do this at scale. So one of the things that companies started doing is that they created something called the Global Internet Forum to Counter Terrorism. It was spun up in 2017 by a group of companies, Google, Facebook, Microsoft, and Twitter. And basically they created a hash database, just like the copyright context, for violent extremist content. And again, in the early days, this was really informal. So they rotated the chairmanship of this board across of this organization across the companies, but it was basically, probably a mailing list with some meetings. And what is interesting here, so there's two things. So it's a mailing list, coordination mechanism, but they created a hash database, which they then started sharing across the companies. And after the Christchurch shooting happened in New Zealand in 2019, this kind of organization became a major tool through which the companies tried to kind of comply with pressure from major government stakeholders, the New Zealand government, the French government. And since it started, it's become kind of more and more institutionalized. So it's now actually a nonprofit, a 501c based in New York. It has, actual guidelines and meetings. It's got a board, an advisory committee that actually features a mix of civil society groups and governments, which is really interesting. And their main kind of product now, they have various things they do. They've developed this kind of response protocol, which we can talk about a little bit too. So it's more in the terms of practices, but they're also building a technical infrastructure for terrorist content detection. And this is a thing called the Shared Industry Hash Database, which basically allows hashes of all sorts of different types of content to be shared across the companies. And what's interesting is that now there's at least 14, probably more other major companies that are also using this. So everything from LinkedIn to Dropbox to other firms. And again, there's been a lot written about this by civil society. One thing is that there still hasn't been a lot of work about this organization and what exactly it does. So there are working groups, but again, there's never been an audit of this database. So we don't know exactly what's in it. The widespread assumption and critique that many kind of more critical researchers have levied is that this is something that almost exclusively focused on the kind of post 9/11 security apparatus and the kind of core terrorist groups that were of interest there. So there's been a lot of critiques levied that, for example, it doesn't really feature far-right extremist or white supremacist terrorist groups. And again, this is something that I think we see is just that this is a massively, massively political undertaking, and that defining terrorism and figuring out what types of groups are considered terrorist groups is super geopolitical. So there are broad transparency and accountability and fairness concerns that have been levied about this organization by all sorts of civil society groups, EDRI, EFF, etc. There's a lot written about it. I can drop some stuff in the chat. And these actors tend to argue that this whole process is basically, maybe in the same way that Content ID was really driven by copyrights holders, this is something that has really been driven by the kind of counter-violent extremism industrial complex by national security officials in different countries. And as I mentioned here, exactly this question of, who defines what terrorism is, who gets to add stuff to the database, so not just in terms of first principles, but who adds content to this, and then how is it used by the different firms. So do firms verify all the hashes before they start using them themselves? Is it just the kind of core group of firms that can add content to this database, or do they also take content from smaller companies, for example? There's some really bizarre companies that use this. The weirdest one I've seen is, I believe, a e-scooter company, which I assume, I guess, hashes profile pictures or something. But again, it's just not really clear how this is actually being used in practice. And as part of this project, what's interesting is that it's not just a technical infrastructure, but it's also a capacity building infrastructure. So they now have an annual meeting, and it's become a kind of venue through which government interests can kind of exert pressure onto companies. And this is spilling over into also forms of predictive classification. So as I mentioned earlier, it's not just through hashing, but it's also through NLP and through other tools that companies are increasingly seeking to be more proactive on, for example, terrorist content. And this is very interesting. If you read the reports that companies are releasing at the end of the year, they're increasingly touting this as the way that they deal with content moderation now. So they're saying, we were able to remove 99.8% of terrorist content on our platform automatically. We didn't even need a human in the loop. This is fantastic. But I mean, if you drill down, it's a little bit more complicated. So yeah, I just wanted to maybe wrap up here with a few very broad kind of issues and points for discussion for us and for you and the broader FACT community. And again, this isn't anything groundbreaking. My first point basically is that I think this is a domain that matters. Platform governance more broadly and algorithmic platform governance especially. So while the stakes might seem lower than high stakes public sector implementations of things like, I don't know, recidivism scoring or some kind of health classification system, these systems at scale I think can still have an impact on people and on broad populations, especially those who are being subject to these kinds of fairly opaque systems without really a way to contest them. Yeah, and especially given the kind of future trend where this type of content scoring, content detection is just intensifying, both through a combination of increasing scale, the increasing sophistication and development of these types of systems, but also regulatory pressure, which is incentivizing, often quite nakedly, companies to really deploy these types of tools as a good solution. The second point is that there are major fairness, accountability, and transparency issues with these systems. And I haven't really gone into them in depth, especially on the predictive side, but I think there's a lot that we can say about these various systems. And this is probably an area where our expertise is much greater than mine. But we're talking about hate speech or toxic speech detection systems. There are well-documented issues with these systems, not just in terms of bias, but also now in terms of their explainability, auditability. And again, I would say that this is, I guess, an emerging area, but the bar is just so low so far. So something like the GIFCT or Content ID, as far as I know, has zero third-party oversight or auditing of any sort, not even a trusted third party. So no one really knows what's in the Content ID database. There could be many things that got in there by mistake. It's probably tens, hundreds of millions of hashes by now, maybe even billions. So this is just something that, again, folks are doing the work and actively trying to organize around this, but we still have a long way to go. And the third broad point I want to make is that, yeah, power matters, and the kind of political economic context in which these systems are created seem to really matter. And these also create kind of path dependencies for which stakeholders are going to be, I guess, assuaged in the meaning of this making of the system. And yeah, I guess what the kind of long-term downstream implications are. And maybe just one quick thing that's interesting here is that these systems are just intensifying, and one of the major trends, for example, is that these things are moving down the stack. So they're getting more embedded at the infrastructure layer. They're going on device. At least that's a big conversation that's happening right now around client-side scanning. So the idea that it's not enough for WhatsApp, for example, to just do this kind of thing on unencrypted plain text content like profile videos, but they should be able to also do this within the app on your phone. So, when you have the phone and you see things in clear text unencrypted, they should also be able to match, for example, all the images that you're sending to a hash list that would be on your phone. And again, there's a lot of security engineering kind of implications of this. There's a lot of political implications to all this. So yeah, that's, I think, it for now. I think we have 15 minutes or so for questions. These are some of the papers that I mentioned here. Please check them out if you're interested. And yeah, I'm so happy to be in Seoul. And yeah, thanks very much. So how should we do this Q&A? I mean, maybe, I'm supposed to be all prepared for a cool hands-on tutorial. But should we use this mic?
Does the other mic work here as well?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I'll take this one and I can take it out.
Awesome.
Thank you. Maybe you can do control on the thing.
Thank you for that. That was super interesting. I wanted to ask about the second item. If you go one slide back, this one about explainability issues, maybe, which is I think a really interesting and complicated one in this context. Do you think there's some kind of it seems to me like there could be a natural tension here, where if you go full sort of transparent and explainable, you're potentially enabling bad actors to kind of game the system. And this is just one example of, I feel like this whole area is full of like impossible kind of problems, right? Like you need to strike some equilibrium between inconsistent goals. Is this something people have kind of worked on? It sounded like you said this is a bit more of an emerging area. I haven't seen much on this, but if you just say maybe a little more about that and like the issues that people are maybe thinking about in this area, I'd be curious to hear that.
Yeah. Yeah, thanks, David. That's a great question. So, I mean, I think this is a really important area, especially given, I guess, the ways that these systems are used in pretty high stakes contexts. Like, I didn't talk about it that much, but child sexual abuse material, for example, CSAM detection. So there are clearly reasons why, especially, industry will stress this, why we can't, they will say they can't be fully transparent about how these systems are working. And there's already a lot of adversarial behavior that we know is going on. So in the sense that, folks are re-uploading content, for example, and cropping it and rotating it and applying color filters and editing it in all sorts of ways to try to get around these systems. So it's a bit of a cat and mouse game that already is going on. So I think, I guess my policy recommendation there would basically be to think about this in different contexts, maybe along a kind of risk trajectory or high stakes trajectory. And I would say, sure, like there's a stronger argument for less explainable systems in that context. But I think there are still ways to maybe, have some kind of safeguards that still, allow us to remedy some of the potential most egregious issues just with misclassifications or with misinsertions into these databases, for example. So, we don't need this database to be public, but maybe we can have a trusted third party researchers or some other type of actor that can go and kind of write an independent report, for example. So that's just like one quick reaction. But yeah, there's a big question here, and I think your point about this being like impossible questions and trade-offs is very much on point. About, I guess, also, yeah, what it means for users in terms of like, how do you contest a decision? To what extent do these companies have an obligation to tell you that they've basically made an automated decision about you through this ways? I guess it would be interesting, maybe some of you who have a more legal background in this room, to hear, you know, to what extent does something like a hashing system fulfill the definition of like a fully automated decision, as Frederick was talking about, under something like the GDPR. So yeah, but in terms of like technical work that actually is looking at the ways that these types of classification systems could be more explainable, at least to the public user, there's not really much, because they're so secretive and so much of this is proprietary, right? And these are just the ones we know about, but we know that companies are, you know, deploying massive, you know, tons of different classifiers that they're then using in all sorts of different ways. So yeah, but thank you. Thanks, David.
Thanks, Mark.
My question's actually just sort of flown out of my mind.
We're all jet lagged. Yeah, and I got here last week, so I don't have any excuses either. But
Thanks, Rob. David here. Hi.
hey,
So this kind of problem, and you know, I've read some of your papers, they're really great. I'm also wondering, a lot of this research is kind of focused on moderation or censorship or removal, but kind of, you know, like as Gillespie also keeps reminding us, all you know, everything on the platform is moderated. All speech and, you know, online communication couldn't exist without moderation. It's all filters. You know, prioritized, downvoted, all of that also exists. That doesn't really seem to enter conversations on moderation as much as kind of pure removal of speech issues. And I think it has like fairly distinct implications, right, on kind of the ordering of media per se. It's often doesn't fit the traditional definitions of censorship, which is why kind of legal standards also can't be applied to things like downvoting or what people might call shadow banning and so on. So just wondering what your perspective on that may be.
yeah, thanks, Divish. Yeah, that's a great question. So there has been a little bit of work on this, especially recently. So the media and comms people often call this like visibility moderation. And this is something that's really important, especially on platforms like TikTok, for example, right, which are really feed driven. So if your content isn't getting recommended to people, that de facto, it might not be actually removed, but that can have the same impact. But I think we're still pretty early on in terms of like actually thinking about the, I guess, political and like, you know, broader implications of that. You know, I think for legal scholars, especially who work on free expression issues, it's a bit harder for them to make a case, you know, for how this is a harm. Even though obviously we can see certain viewpoints being suppressed. TikTok has, you know, has had many scandals around this. The other person who's working on this from a legal context, who has done some interesting work that Michael maybe has also recommended, is Patty Learson, because there are some interesting things in the DSA, the Digital Services Act, which is kind of being hashed out in the EU right now, about recommender systems. So I would agree with you that there seems to be a little bit of a divide between like this more pure takedown moderation research and the more recommenders ranking systems research. But through regulatory initiatives like the DSA, those things I think are kind of meeting. And there's a provision, at least, you know, God, we can't keep up with which DSA is actually the DSA. You know, poor folks read the 600-page leaked draft only to find out that it wasn't actually the final version, you know. But theoretically, there seems to be a provision in there which would require platforms to inform users if basically negative, if downranking happens. And this is really interesting in terms of implementation question. Does this mean that companies can just get around this by saying, okay, we're not using negative weights anymore, right? And we'll just reinterpret everything as a tiny positive weight. You know, this is an open question, but I think it's something that's playing out in policy where at least in the EU, policymakers are recognizing that this is also a thing, right? Yeah. So that this is obviously an important part of kind of content discovery. But yeah, thank you for the great question.
That reminded me what my question was. But also that helps tee up Dave for the keynote panel on algorithmic governance of the public sphere, where the focus really is on amplification as well as reduction, as distinct from moderation and removal, or sort of as continuous with them, but as they're going to be the focus of that discussion.
Yeah.
And Daphne Keller's paper on regulating algorithmic amplification is a really good touchstone there. So the question I had though was about sort of how you think about this type of governance and the sort of the standards of legitimacy that apply to it. And so there's sort of, as I see it, there's two broad kind of spheres here. One of them is better established, and the other one a little bit newer. And I'm curious to know where you see yourself fitting. So on the one hand, there's a kind of sort of digital constitutionalism idea, according to which we want to have some sort of basic kind of quasi-constitutional rights in this environment. And that's generally associated with sort of emphasizing kind of standards of procedural justice, procedural fairness. Like you said, notifying people if they're being demoted or shadow banned or their content being removed, giving them opportunities for appeal and that sort of thing. So it's very much focused on the idea of sort of individual standing to make a complaint on the basis of how you've been governed. And then on the other hand, there's a more sort of kind of administrative, kind of top-down type approach that looks at the evaluation of these systems as a whole, rather than trying to kind of litigate every particular decision that they make on behalf of the individuals who are part of them. I'm curious to know your thoughts on those different approaches and whether you think that there's more to be said there.
Yeah, that's a great question, Seth, and thank you. It's a tricky one because, yeah, like you said, I think so. There's a lot of activity that is, I guess, happening in this kind of almost due process vein, right? And I agree. I think my critique also would be that it doesn't always. I mean, how helpful is it to really focus on the individual user autonomy, especially if we're moving into things like, downranking and demotion? I guess my tendencies are more aligned with this kind of systems-oriented approach. But even in regulation that is allegedly, systems-oriented, like the DSA, because the context for this before was like things that had specific prescriptions for individual cases of content, right? And takedowns around that content, et cetera, the way that individual decisions were handled. In Brazil, for example, I think there's an interesting bill which really introduces the role of the judiciary. And this is something that we're seeing in the DSA too, where theoretically we're creating an individual decision appeals mechanism that then could be kind of shot outside to courts, for example, for outside adjudication. So, even in the DSA, which is more systemic, we're still seeing this kind of more individualist lens. And I don't know how to think about it, to be honest. I think, I would love to have a conversation about this. I think there's two things going on. Like on one hand, it seems like for policymakers, this is just the most clear way through which they understand how to approach this issue. And there's something to be said about things like the Santa Clara Principles, which is a civil society-led set of, I guess, it's a wish list of things that civil society wants companies to do in content moderation. And a big focus of this is individual transparency, right? Because the argument there, I think, is there's so little transparency as it exists now that anything you layer on top is going to be some kind of benefit. But in terms of like longer term structural overhauls of the system, I don't really know. I guess one additional thought here, and something that I've personally been interested in, is the way that these types of regulatory efforts that we're seeing, even when they're like, theoretically the most costly or the most radical, are still kind of entrenching the existing relationship between platforms and governments, for example, and basically maybe constituting a more kind of formal delegation of their role in the public sphere in a way, right? So this is the idea that, okay, as David put it, there are really, really difficult questions here. And it seems like a lot of governments aren't saying that we can actually solve this. We don't think that at scale, it's actually feasible for us to do this through the courts instead. clearly at, billions of pieces of content a day. So we're going to try to add a veneer of, due process and transparency to the system. I guess my last question here is the way that like enforcement plays into this and how this actually just works in practice, right? So, something like the NetzDG, which is often critiqued, the German network enforcement law, as being a very individual content-centric law, the fine structure there is actually set up around systemic failures of the system. And so far as I know, I think there's only been one failure or one fine issued, which was to Facebook after the way that they set up their complaints handling form was very opaque intentionally. But yeah, I think theoretically a regulator could do a lot with saying, okay, we want to achieve some kind of systemic goals or targets, and we're going to try to prod you in that direction. But exactly this question of broader legitimacy issues, that's not something I have the answer to right now. I think we have 1 minute, so maybe that's it, or maybe we have one more question. Yeah. And then...
Thanks. I'm Meg Young. This was a
hi.
really substantive talk. I have a question about any trends you see in devolving power to local language moderators or admins. I think that Facebook is trying to boost the groups feature for that reason, and because of the cross-cultural and cross-language really disturbing implications of some of the decisions when they're left to algorithms. I was just wondering what you see on the landscape and on the horizon there.
That's also a really good question. I think quickly in the kind of commercial context of content moderation, it's difficult to see that happening in terms of actual delegation. I think one clear trend is that companies are at least deploying more resources locally where there's public pressure to do so, right? So an interesting thing that also, for example, is in the German NetzDG, if you have transparency around where content moderators are located, then you can exert pressure to say, okay, we need more moderation infrastructure locally. But this is clear, this is a clear issue in terms of the global distribution of resources that are being dedicated by companies to this, right? So yeah, I'll be interested to see if this is like a policy lever that more people start pressing. But yeah, broader things like the turn to groups, I think are really interesting. Maybe even like Twitter Spaces or other things where the companies say, okay, you guys can set this up and moderate it on your own. And yeah, I guess I'd be interested still in like empirics about how much of, for example, Facebook activity is actually happening in those groups, and to what extent that can, remedy some of the problems we're seeing here. What I think, maybe just one final note, and maybe a pessimistic one, is that I've increasingly, I guess, been just thinking about how, we're in a kind of, I don't know, devil's bargain, and it's very difficult to improve this context without kind of tearing down the entire infrastructure of this. Because again, it's just difficult to see how these types of platforms at scale can do this well. Again, we've gotten into this kind of status quo where it seems good enough for a lot of stakeholders. Governments are increasingly saying, okay, at least we have something that we can signal to our constituencies, et cetera, in terms of you doing more in this case. But the question of like actually involving users, communities in some kind of form of participatory governance, we're not really scratching the surface on that yet, at least at this kind of industrial layer. So maybe through policy interventions like interoperability, this could be something that we could see in the longer term. Again, the question of how we moderate across an interoperable network of platforms, I think, isn't settled, but that's really an interesting area. So yeah, so anyway, I think that's lunchtime. And I'm getting hungry, but thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate it. And yeah, I hope to see you around. Thank you.
Thank you. Hi, how's it
I
going?
couldn't find you a spot. I'm a policymaker
Oh,
for
wow,
national
hi.
government in Canada.
Oh,
I
nice to
don't
meet
know
you.
what we
Yeah,
do
that's
anymore.
fine. Cool.
Can we chat later?
Yeah, sure.
I'm working on.
Oh, really? Yeah, cool. I'm Canadian.
Oh, are you?
Yeah.
Okay, amazing.
Which
I'm
bill?
with UST and
Okay.
and defense.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Like heritage or?
Environment Canada.
Sorry to
Okay,
interrupt.
yeah, please.
That was great. If you want to chat it, let's have lunch together. And
Okay, yeah, fine. I mean, I don't have a card, but yeah, you can find, I have a,
Are you?
I'm not on the conference call? No, but you can find me in this pop-in thing if are you in this platform? Yeah, I'm in here. Or, sure, this is my, yeah, this is my website. Yeah, or send me an email, or I'm here until Saturday. Okay, cheers. Hey, how's it going? Hi. Nice to meet you.
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks for coming.
Yeah, because actually I saw your
Yeah?
good.
Oh, thank you so much.
Actually, your research is very related to my further research.
What are you working on?
Actually, your research is in the level.
Yeah.
I'm focusing on the community level moderation. Such
Okay,
as,
cool.
Each community
Yes.
has different community level.
Yeah.
They need to
Yeah.
make their own algorithm model to
Yes.
automated moderation. So actually, and I have a question about the flexibility of the platform level terms.
Yeah.
So such as if big events happen, so many people like COVID,
Yeah.
at the time, you said about a lot of categories they need to that automated moderation system works. But actually, COVID is not the optional of the category.
Yeah.
So in this case, such as there are a lot of customized, there are a lot of categories needs customized filters. I want to ask about your perspective about that.
Yeah.
And how can we solve that
Oh my
problem?
God, that's such a hard question. That's a good question. Yeah, I mean, I didn't even talk about there's health moderation. There's so many different contexts in which this is used. But yeah, are you working mainly on Korean platforms? Because that's also something which.
Oh no, I'm working about the Reddit platform.
Oh, Reddit.
And also I focus on Reddit on moderator.
Okay, cool.
Yeah. Which is good. But actually, every time I explain about the Reddit auto moderator, they said that, oh, maybe that kind of filter-based, rule-based
Yeah.
system can be replaced by the algorithmic model or ML-based model. They can do it well. Why do you research about that? But actually, it is difficult to justify my research. Actually, my thought is just it is more customizable and you can see how it works.
It's a bit more transparent, maybe.
Transparent and also, yeah, it is more in the COVID situation. They can use that kind of filter and they can deploy it lively. It's not live, so. We can take account into those kind of problem with the Reddit auto moderator. But actually, I thought that maybe rule-based system can be replaced. But I think there is some kind of step to the algorithm.
So one of those slides, what's interesting is like this, they might be starting to use. Like these guys say Reddit is a client, right? So, but I don't know in which context they're using this on Reddit, because I guess also certain subreddits can choose their own moderation.
Not the subreddit. That is just Reddit.
Yeah, for spam user accounts, right? Anyway, that's interesting.
But they show some kind of customized filter for their system. But I haven't seen other community use those kind of commercial systems, moderation systems, because they are all volunteers and they don't have expensive. Yes, right. So,
well, if you have any work on this, please email me. I'd love to read it.
Oh, thank you so much. Yeah, but I want to share my research. It's difficult to show the importance of the all research.
I get it. Yeah, pleasure, man. Pleasure. Good to meet you. Hey, hi.
Christina, University of Bremen. So I'm very familiar with Christian research. I was getting into sort of the dichotomy. Yes, computer science. Yeah. So I'm more from the AI ethics side of things.
Master your song in some way that sounds in conjunction. It's like
reasons. I'm currently looking at like the dichotomy of soft versus hard governance. So which I'm thinking about hard governance in the sense of the DSA, the AI Act, if this then comes in force at some point, and also soft governance like AI ethics guidelines to enforcement checklists, blah blah blah. I'm wondering if you have any experience on that platform. Have you ever seen this?
I guess if you start
like these
having people on that side
for trustworthy AI?
who actually know how to do this well, they
No.
might often look, this is imprecise.
I will have to think about
Standard that is set.
but no, not as far as I
Propagate
know.
that back up and try
And
to
what's interesting is maybe that like the way it seems to me like these systems
our
are
law is
is just it's very opaque as to what they're
probably
actually doing.
Yeah.
this
It's
is
pretty
like
proprietary.
increasingly
So they're not saying and this could be a trend though. I mean, if they're saying if regulators are pressuring us to say we want you to be there's some kind of standard for these classifiers, for example. But that's actually interesting.
I mean, the AI Act has some ethics part in it, but it happens so often, it's very hard to actually
And
implement.
also, I don't really understand if this would be in scope, right? Because it's not really focusing on platforms, it's focusing more on service delivery, no?
It's regulating what can go on the market.
Right, product, but
Product.
yeah.
dangerous.
Maybe, I don't know.
I mean, I went to Michael Deal gave a talk on this, and he kind of was like, most of this is going to be out of scope with the AI Act as it is now, which surprised me. But I don't know. But that's really interesting. Also, I mean, I can try to send you an email if I think of anything. But as
I'll
far as I
send you an
know,
email. Also, I was wondering why you're not listing TikTok. Have you tried to do something?
not yet. I mean, I finished the PhD and then
Okay.
there's a couple people. There's a really good paper by James Zhang. They did a paper TikTok paper. I can't remember
This is not what I'm suggesting.
Yeah, please. Yeah, lovely to meet you. Yeah, take care.
I
That's
see.
all. Hey,
I'm kind of projecting what.
Thanks for the message.
can happen, and I feel like there has to be equivalent responses on the.
I'm looking at your infrastructure and a lot of that infrastructure is kind of adopting for instance, you have plugin based advertising service for platform processing. So it is generating content, this content is data set. I was wondering if you've seen any work and these platforms are because of these sorts of conferences and demonstrations and think about governance in these contexts. So I was wondering if you work that was starting to think about how principles and research and content moderation is being translated or applied to moderation
That's a really good question. I haven't seen much work on this. I mean, I think it seems to me also almost like Peter Pan communities, right? Like the folks are interested in
No, I
more infrastructure value chain creating systems. I guess one thing that would be, so this is almost meta, right? So we're talking about platforms that would be offering different types of data sets that people can use to train classifiers or classifiers with platforms. Share. So there's moderation questions basically similar to content moderation around what happens, like for instance, hugging places, so for instance, there's interesting questions around like emotions affection and largely because the partners. So what do you do in those people who are loaded emotion affection? Have you written about this yet?
No, not yet, but I would like to. But I can do it.
Luckily, I also like that.
That's super.
Hi, good. I'm Emily. I'm actually also pretty Canadian. Yeah, for Vancouver. I look at your profile. You went to UBC. Oh, you were Vancouver too. Yeah, and then you also went to. I actually went to Oxford for undergrad, so like, we have so much in common. Yeah, I know. Yeah, I felt like I was going to transfer out to UBC. And like first year, I called my mom, being like, "I don't go to UBC. My friends are all there. Why am I here?" And they're like, "See you." Well, look at you now. I'm actually a competition lawyer in my background, and I was wondering if you could I don't know if you see any of the debates about how competition law might and content moderation kind of are not antithetical, like with the debate on the U.S. about with the like Senator Klobuchar has put out a bill, and people are saying now Google or Apple App Store. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Have you come across anything maybe outside of the US talking about how content moderation and competition or saying more antithetical to each other? I could see the whole like self-preferencing thing as just making sense, right? So like Google can take down like another app like YouTube, and then they can be like, well, you're putting out content that's harmful, and then that app can be like, well, it's competitive. Yeah.
That's a great question. So, one thing I is actually where they had it was more focused on marketplaces. If they had a law which basically outlaws companies from offering their own product. So it's like you can add the marketplace, or you can sell them for free. So like they basically like outlawed companies. I guess there's a question of whether or not that is content moderation. I guess in a way they're setting some kind of rules that kind of sellers are allowed. So maybe, but overall, I don't know. I think it's interesting that you bring your question because most of what I see is more higher level. It's like, what if we broke Facebook got one of the moderation? Possibility, which is like maybe a PMA. What was that for moderation? But I haven't seen that much.
Yeah, a lot of the data line, lots of good women went on, because that's what we teach you, like the law students there. And I was like, yes, good. So, yeah, anyway, I will, and I get in touch with you because a lot of the Catholic government stuff we teach at NYU Law, and I'm sure like our students. Yeah, but my interest has been kind of veered from initially like platform governance, big tech, like traditional antitrust big tech, to more like at the moment, my research is more on infrastructure and how that's structural analysis and infrastructure and power quantification. I'll send you an email because I'm at an institute in NYU that just does data law, a lot of infrastructural analysis. Yeah, I work with Thomas. He's the one.
I've never met him, but I know him.
He told me I should come to the session. He was like, please go to this one if you can. So, yeah.
They're also
Thomas will be so flattered that you know. Yeah, I'll come copy him actually in the email. He's in Lisbon. I think so. And then he's in Germany most of the time. Yeah, I'll put you guys in touch.
Hey man, how are you? I really enjoyed it. Yeah, I felt yeah. Just thought
Was it okay? Yeah,
No,
man. First
really.
fact talk.
a bit. Yeah, no, it was brilliant. Except for the text, I don't know what the hell was.
This is good, right? No hate, 99%.
Brilliant. They've solved it.
They solved it, man.
We've solved it.
Maybe I'll just cheekily leave this up here.
Yeah, see, there's probably some rep from the company gets sued.
Yeah, exactly. I was like, I'm about to get
some commission. Get sued. I thought I'd ask you now. Just
saves talking shop over beers. Yeah, in your last slide, you had that first point, saying basically algorithmic governance still matters, platform governance still matters, even though it's maybe not as high stakes. Just kind of curious, like, how do you find the literature that kind of splits off platform governance, almost being, purely content focused? Because almost all text becoming platform governance. But if you just see platform governance, almost the second you read the paper, it's in social media, which I think
I am very guilty of this.
So just was curious your take on that. And also, like, are they kind of, what aspects do you think are specific to concept platforms versus public important?
Yeah, so I mean, mate, this is such a good question. I think, so one of the things when I started this postdoc was like,
They gave us like lots of ones. I didn't try it last night. Where did you fly? Yeah. What? I was here once yesterday, but I just like to take pictures for my daughter. Hair has been like long standing. Hair was like kind of like reluctantly was like hair, that's right. I feel like I haven't like being based on I haven't been listening to for a long time. Yeah. No, I mean, I go to that. I mean, I'm sure there is. Yeah, Robin. Oh, yeah. Like, Policy space, I'm like trying to be like, so I'm here. Okay, please. Oh no! Oh, so bad. That's like I've seen a lot of it. Around AI. I think like just like actually everyone like has just like I'm like people in and then I went somewhere and like no one knows. Well, we've about talking about wow, I haven't seen CSE. So it's been a minute, like it's still in the You would never know how to fly. Just the white background and I'm not a development person, nor am I a communication person, so I'm yeah, there's a lot of stuff. Yeah, like this, our like one other person like like I would set an example. I mean, internally in Ring, where it's like they wanted to put in the chat API, like CPU has, so as a result, a lot of it they were funding. Like CPU has a lot of reasons why. Like figuring out like so I mean, I think it should be way better than the meeting 5 seconds. So yeah, this is like I feel like this is really like things like that. This should be the thing that we do. So I'm like, it feels the like and so when I like yeah, right.
We are the student association. Oh, great. I have no idea. Do you know?
Any one of my languages.
They did not give me a line. But here I'm ready to do. We'll figure it out.
This is the wrong one.
It's just we can leave.